So AMD stock has been all over the place. Just on Monday, it was up by over 11%, and then the very next day on Tuesday, it actually dropped by over 10%. So naturally, I've been receiving a lot of comments and messages asking me what's going on with AMD and if I can do an update video on the stock and let you guys know how I currently feel about AMD and everything that's going on. So that's what we're going to do today, guys. Let's go ahead and get started. What's up, everybody? My name is Ala and welcome to my world of stocks. So like I said, the past few days have been kind of all over the place for AMD stock, but even the last few months have been just as volatile as well. In fact, they were up 22% in July, up 37% in August, up 22% in September, and then they finally crashed down over 40% in October before rebounding about 17% in November and currently trade for around $21 per share and are still up over 100% year to date and almost 800% in the past 3 years. Now, if you guys have been watching the channel for a while, then you know that I've been an investor in AMD for a pretty long time. Historically, I bought most of my shares under about $10 per share. That's where I really went heavy into AMD. But as it continued to climb, I did pick up some more shares along the way as well. But it got to a point this year where it just climbed too high and, more importantly, too fast. And I just didn't feel comfortable with that kind of climb. So I ended up cashing in a large portion of my position in AMD to cash in a lot of those really high profits that I was making. The stock ended up climbing much higher than that, and it reached above $30 per share. So I kind of felt like an idiot, but the stock did end up crashing back down eventually. Like you saw in October, it was down by over 40%. And then my decision started to look a lot, smarter than it originally did. But in the long term, I am still one of the biggest bulls on AMD that you'll find out there. And so that's why I've held on to my reduced position, my smaller position, basically just held on to that as a long-term investment. But when looking at the reasons why AMD stock crashed, I mean, at one point it came all the way down to around $16 per share. So that was a significant drop from over $30 per share. It's like a 50% drop that you're talking about there, depending on exactly the time frame that you're looking at. But the reasons why really ranges from analyst downgrades to reports coming out that Intel was actually going to speed up their 10 nanometer production, of their 10 nanometer chips and maybe get those out sooner than we previously expected. And then there was also the whole crypto mining slowdown. Cryptocurrency prices really crashed. And so not as many people were mining cryptocurrencies. It wasn't as profitable anymore. So they didn't have to use AMD products. And that really hurt AMD's blockchain related sales, which used to fluff up their numbers in the past. And now they're virtually non-existent. You really can't rely on any kind of blockchain sales when looking at AMD or even Nvidia and some other companies as well. But on top of all of this, there is also the whole trade fight between the US and China, and that's really starting to hurt them and impact them quite significantly right now. Now, I've gone through several different reports trying to figure out how much of AMD's business actually comes from China. In other words, how much of AMD's total revenue is actually coming in from business being done in China. And a lot of these different reports and websites give different numbers. It's kind of hard to find one that seems correct, but I've seen reports from Fox Business, CNBC, and even the Motley Fool all giving a similar range of around 26 to 33% of AMD's total revenue coming from China. So that's actually pretty darn significant. That's a very large portion of their total revenue. And that's a big deal because rising tariffs could dramatically increase the price of AMD chips being sold in China, which would make consumers much less likely to purchase AMD products. Now, the latest development in the trade fight was that the US had implemented tariffs on about $250 billion worth of Chinese imports. That includes a 10% tax on $200 billion worth, and that would actually increase to 25% if a deal was not reached by the end of the year. Now, China, on the other hand, implemented tariffs on over $100 billion worth of US goods, which is actually most of the US imports going into China when you consider that in 2017, China imported around $130 billion worth of goods from the US, while the US imported much more at over $500 billion from China. And then more reports came out later saying that if trade talks at the G20 summit, which actually just happened, we'll talk about it in just a second, but they were basically saying that if trade talks go poorly there and no kind of resolution is found or anything like that, then the US would add tariffs to the remainder of Chinese imports, which would be around double the amount. So if all of that sounds scary, then why then did AMD stock jump up over 11% on Monday? Well, that's because the G20 summit was this past weekend, and reports came out that President Trump and President Xi had agreed to a ceasefire on any additional tariffs for 90 days, which essentially means that we will not be getting those 25% tariffs that everyone was freaking out about until sometime around March of 2019. On top of that, China had essentially agreed to lower tariffs on US automobiles and also begin to purchase agricultural products from the US once again. And so all of that sounds pretty good, right? We have another 3 months to kind of get all of this figured out, lowering tariffs from, in terms of China. And we have a lot more time to just kind of get a deal done. So all of this sounds good. So then you're probably wondering, well, why then did AMD stock drop the following day on Tuesday by over 10%? Well, it really comes down to uncertainty. See, President Xi claims that the 90-day kind of grace period or truce period starts at the end of the year, while President Trump claims that it actually starts from the G20 summit meeting. So it would be actually a smaller time frame. And Trump also added he had a choice of words on his Twitter account that I think the market and investors didn't really find too appealing. And here's what he had to say. He says, "The negotiations with China have already started. Unless extended, they will end 90 days from the date of our wonderful and warm dinner with President Xi in Argentina." In other words, he's talking about the G20 summit. And then he says Bob Lighthizer will be working closely with Steve Mnuchin, Larry Kudlow, Wilbur Ross, and Peter Navarro on seeing whether or not a real deal with China is actually possible. If it is, we will get it done. China is supposed to start buying agricultural product and more immediately. President Xi and I want this deal to happen, and it probably will. But if not, remember, I am a tariff man. And I just saw that like across a lot of different reports. Everybody was kind of quoting that him saying, I'm a tariff man. And then he says, when people or countries come in to raid the great wealth of our nation, I want them to pay for the privilege of doing so. It will always be the best way to max out our economic power. We are right now taking billions in tariffs. Make America rich again. But if a fair deal is able to be made with China, one that does all of the many things we know must be finally done, I will happily sign. Let the negotiations begin, make America great again. And then later in the day, once the markets had already gone down considerably after all these tweets, Trump tweeted again and he said this: "We are either going to have a real deal with China or no deal at all, at which point we will be charging major tariffs against Chinese products being shipped into the US. Ultimately, I believe we will be making a deal either now or into the future. China does not want tariffs." Okay, so that's one obvious reason why AMD stock dropped on Tuesday. Basically, investors felt that Trump is really prepared to add more tariffs, and maybe this whole truce period isn't really as big of a deal as we previously thought, and tariffs can be added kind of at any moment or much sooner than we expected, which has the possibility to hurt a stock like AMD, which we noted before has about a third of the revenue actually coming from China. That's a pretty big deal. On top of that, it also hurt the overall market in general. And every time that we have the market struggling and being this volatile, risky tech stocks like AMD tend to get crushed, because you can't forget, even at these prices, even at these lower prices for AMD, they're still trading at a PE ratio of like around, I think it's like almost 70 right now. So it's a very high PE ratio. It's a pretty high valuation. So AMD stock is not cheap by any means. And when looking at the market and how much it dropped, the S&P 500 and the tech-heavy NASDAQ both dropped by over 3% on that day alone. So, volatile market conditions like that will absolutely crush stocks like AMD, and that's exactly what we saw. However, another reason why the stock market was really struggling on Tuesday wasn't just because of Trump's tweets, but also because of the yield curve. Now, I'm not an expert in bonds, but I'll just give you kind of a quick explanation in terms of how I understand it. And that's that when investors are very fearful about the economy, when there's a lot of uncertainty and fear going on about the economy, they'll look for safety in other types of investments. One of those being long-term bonds, bonds like the 10-year Treasury note. So in other words, they'll flood into the 10-year Treasury note, which in turn will raise its price, but also lower its yield. And because short-term bond yields tend to correlate with rates set by the Fed, which have been going up recently, we're seeing a decline in the 10-year yield, which you can see on this chart here at around 2.9%, and an increase in the 2-year yield, which you can see on this chart being as high as around 2.8%. So the yield curve, which is essentially the gap between the two yields, so this being the 10-year yield and the 2-year yield, that gap is actually shrinking, and it currently sits at around 0.1%. And the problem with that is that when that gap goes below zero, meaning that the 2-year yield is actually higher than the 10-year yield, we get what is called an inversion, which is usually followed by a recession. In fact, all of the 7 previous recessions have seen an inversion right before it. Now, to be fair, it can sometimes take a couple of years for the recession to hit after an inversion, and we still haven't even technically hit that inversion yet. We're just getting very close. But the fact that it's very close, the fact that the gap is shrinking, was enough to spook investors and cause a sell-off, some panic and a sell-off on Tuesday. So that kind of hurt the market, and that of course also hurt AMD. So my overall opinion on this is that nothing has really changed, and there's not really anything that we haven't seen before. With the whole situation with Trump and the tweets and everything, at the end of the day, we got another 3 months to figure out a deal. A lot of people were screaming about the 25% tariffs hitting at the beginning of 2019. We're not going to have that now. Now we have 3 months, so it'll probably end around March or so. And maybe we get a deal done by then, or maybe we see some more progress, or maybe the ceasefire continues further than that, because during this kind of grace period, this truce period, they're going to keep the tariffs that they have already, but they're not going to increase them anymore. So we could see some progress there, and overall, it's a good sign. I don't see it as a negative thing. Now, you could argue that the way that Trump is handling all of this on Twitter and the choice of words that he's using is hurting the markets, and it's not a good strategy for him to do that. But no matter how you feel about Trump, and I'm just gonna be completely honest with you guys, if you like Trump or you hate Trump or however you feel, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm not really a political person. But I'll just say this, in Trump's mind, everything that he's doing is the right thing to do. He's in full negotiation mode right now. So he's not going to care what we have to say. As investors, we have no chance of changing his mind or, convincing him to act a certain way. He's going to do everything that he thinks he needs to do in order to get what he wants. So as an investor who doesn't really have much control over what Trump is going to do, I just try to think long term, and because at the end of the day, everything could go disastrously wrong, and maybe the tariffs continue to go up, and maybe we hit a recession and everything could just go really, really bad. Or the opposite could happen, and maybe the trade talks go well and we get a deal done by March, and all of this just kind of gets put behind us. I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm not a fortune teller, and I'm not good at predicting any kind of short-term movement. So I just try to think long-term. It's the only way that I can really sleep at night and not really worry about what's going on right now. All I know is that in the long term, this will eventually be behind us. And when looking at AMD's long-term strategy, nothing has really changed. Yes, we're losing the blockchain revenues, but that should be offset by their new product roadmap coming out in 2019. We should be getting 7nm Ryzen chips for the CPU market, 7nm EPYC chips for the server market, and 7nm Vega and then Navi chips for the GPU market. Now, I do think that it will take some time, may take a quarter or 2 quarters, and that's basically what they said in their earnings call. It could take a couple quarters to really recover from the absence of blockchain revenues and get to a normal GPU channel. But all the meanwhile, Intel is actually kind of dropping the ball right now. Intel might Intel might be able to get their 10 nanometer chips out in 2019 and maybe even early 2019, but their server 10 nanometer chips, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that they're still not even scheduled to be out until 2020. So that leaves a pretty large gap there, pretty wide window there for AMD to come in and steal a lot of that server market share. And that's a big deal because AMD is still predicting that they will hit a double-digit market share sometime in 2019. And that could equate to around a 25% or more increase in revenue just from the server market. That's a big deal. And the way I get those numbers is because if you look at AMD's revenue for all of 2018, that will probably be around $6.5 to $7 billion in revenue, somewhere around there. And when you look at 10% of the server CPU market, that would probably equate to around $2 billion, maybe more, maybe less, but around there. So that could easily be around a 25% increase in revenue just from that single server segment. That would be a very big deal. Not to mention that Northland Capital just downgraded Intel to underperform and lowered their price target because they claim to see no signs of Intel ramping up production of their 10 nanometer chips based off conversations that they've had with their industry contacts. So they think that this leaves the door wide open for AMD to steal even more market share in desktop, notebook, and server markets. So how all of that plays out with AMD versus Intel, we'll have to wait and see. You know, I still think it's possible that Intel could maybe ramp up production, and that's a scary thought for AMD. But either way, I'm still very bullish on AMD. I think that they're doing all the right things. I think that they're finally starting to compete against Intel and Nvidia. They're starting to release products that actually matter, that people actually like to use. And that's a big deal because AMD has never really been there before. And they're starting to pick up a lot of traction in the server market, partnerships with like Microsoft and Amazon and all kinds of different huge companies. So it's a big deal. Now, having said all of that, I personally am not buying AMD stock right now. I would probably consider AMD stock at around $15. When they actually dropped all the way down to 16, I was thinking in my head, okay, if they get to around 15, I'll be comfortable there. I'll start buying again, you know, somewhat heavily again into AMD. But at these prices, I mean, they still have a trailing PE of, I think it's like almost 70 right now. So it's still a very high PE. And even forward, I think it might be like around 40 or so. I think it's in the 30s, maybe high 30s. So their PE ratio is still very high. And the problem isn't so much with AMD. If we had a good bull market right now, you know, that I was confident in, AMD stock would be doing great because it's a growth stock that can deliver. They have a lot of future potential. But in these type of market conditions, investors tend to go more for value stocks that have great balance sheets, that have really low valuations, because they look for some safety. Now, if a crash happens, all bets are off. Even some of those quote unquote safe stocks that everybody claims are the magical stocks that you got to buy, you know, before a recession, stuff like that, those get hammered too. So give me a break on that. But to be fair, stocks like AMD get crushed, and a lot of times, you know, much more than some of those other safer stocks. So I will give you that point. Some of those safer stocks still drop a little less, but they still get crushed. But anyway, I don't mean to go off on a rant. My point is that because the market is just so volatile right now, these conditions aren't good for stocks like AMD. So, you know, the way I see it is that I just feel like there's a lot of reasons that investors could find to kind of drag AMD down further. And so I'm kind of waiting for that to happen. You know, I'm not someone who tries to predict short-term movements, but I just feel like there's other better stocks out there at better valuations right now. And so I'm buying other stocks like Disney, for example. Disney, I think, is at a great valuation, and they have a ton of future potential too. I also really like Microsoft. I feel like Microsoft is on fire, and everybody's just kind of ignoring Microsoft recently. I think their performance should be a lot better, but of course that's a reflection of the overall market. So anyway, my point is that I am absolutely bullish on AMD. So don't get me wrong, you know, if you're a bull on AMD, don't get mad at me. I'm absolutely bullish on AMD in the long term, and I'm holding a reduced position in AMD for the long term. But I'm just not buying AMD because I just think the price is still a little too high, and I'd like it to be a little lower. But we'll see what happens. Either way, if it goes up, I can benefit from that. And if it goes down, I will definitely be buying AMD again because I do believe in their future. Anyway, I think that's about it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit the like button. Leave me a comment down below. Do you agree, disagree with anything I said? If you want to talk about Trump and the whole thing with China and everything, absolutely feel free to leave a comment and I'll reply to it and we can have a fun conversation. But anyway, don't forget also to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I just created those and you can find links in the description. And I will catch you guys in the next video. Hope you all have a wonderful, beautiful day and that you take care. Bye-bye.